Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is innovation and how Amazon approaches it, but also use some anecdotes from history as a bit of a guide. But I want to start by talking about innovation as an economic driver. So it's probably not a surprise to any of you that innovation drives microeconomic value. And so what you see here is a chart that shows the R&D budgets and how much these companies have invested in new technologies, new innovations over the years, and the resulting stock increase, right? So there is a direct correlation. The companies that are viewed as the most innovative, the ones that are pouring the most amount of R&D budgets into new innovations, are the ones who are seeing the greatest returns. But innovation is also a macroeconomic driver. And so you see this quote from The Economist. More and more, it's becoming critical to any modern economy. So innovation at a macroeconomic level, at a microeconomic level, makes a huge impact. But the reality is, it's really, really difficult. So it's very difficult to build a culture of innovation when you're inside a company that's thinking about the next quarterly results, right? The next quarterly financial results. You are kind of beholden to the street, right? You want to make sure you have the financial returns, but at the same time, you want to innovate, but how do you do that? How do you create a culture of innovation where it may not exist today within your company? Well, we'll get there, but before that, I want to start with a little story about what does innovation look like, or maybe what does it not look like. So we're going to go way back. We're going to go back to the early 19th century, and if you had to get goods from point A to point B over a long distance, you used one of these. It's a schooner. A schooner was a ship that was built for the purpose of transporting goods from point A to point B. And a traditional schooner had two masts. Now, logically, as people were delivering goods and services, they realized, well, if I can get my goods from point A to point B faster, I can have more routes, I can make more money. And so, in the spirit of innovation, the three-masted schooner was developed. Okay, so they added another mast. Indeed, that ship was able to go from point A to point B quicker. The people who owned those boats were able to have more routes and therefore make more money. But it didn't stop there. The four-masted schooner was developed. The five-masted schooner was developed. Now, really cutting-edge stuff, folks. I mean, they're adding another mast to a boat. This is innovation, right? The six-masted schooner. Now you're thinking, how many pictures of boats could he possibly have? All right, I promise this is the last one. This is a ship called the Thomas W. Lawson. It was built in 1902 for a whopping cost at the time of $250,000. It is the only seven-masted schooner ever built. And it didn't last very long for a lot of reasons. It had a bunch of design flaws. But the real reason it didn't last very long is that everyone who was focused on building the next variation of the sailing ship was being bypassed by the steamship. The people who were innovating, the real innovation was taking place in the steamship industry. And they were developing new tools, new models that could allow steamships to be brought to the market. And of course, the sailing vessel, as we know it, for business, disappeared. Okay, so Amazon. So yes, I work within the Amazon Web Services division, right? So the cloud part of Amazon. But Amazon is a company, and we're very proud of the fact that we have been recognized by a number of journals as a very innovative company. Well, how did we get there, right? Because if you think about Amazon when we started, 1994, Amazon was an online bookseller. But over the course of our history, we've been able to innovate across many domains. Most recently in drone development, drone delivery, but in areas like grocery delivery, video streaming. You see the Fire OS, which started as the Kindle, cloud computing, which is Amazon Web Services, in-home entertainment, and Alexa or the Echo devices, which we just saw, as part of our partnership with BMW. That's where this technology is going. But when the Kindle was first released, there were a lot of reviews that spoke quite negatively about it and said, is this something people actually want? Or what's the point of having a device that only does one thing? And the e-reader at the time, no one actually, a lot of the people who were writing reviews were saying this is not a necessary piece of technology. Why did Amazon develop it? Well, innovation requires a culture that fosters invention, right? And so you have to be unafraid. But in order to do that, there have to be elements within your company that are working with you and not against you. So when we look at Amazon, there are a few key elements of innovation. The first and really the most important is a focus on our customers. So when you look at things that Amazon develops and the new services and features that Amazon Web Services comes out with, a vast majority of that is driven directly by customer feedback. So we have this idea that's called working backwards. So I'm going to tell you this is a very true statement. If you are within any group within Amazon today, and you have an idea for a new product or service, you think it's a good idea, the first thing you do is not to build a business case. It's actually to write a press release. You are asked, as an employee of the company, to envision 18 months, 24 months into the future, that product or service is ready to be delivered to the market. What are you going to say? And what is the value that it's going to bring to end consumers? If you can't articulate your idea in a press release, you do not get the green light for that project. So it really does start with the customer and work backwards from there. We experiment frequently, we measure, improve, and iterate, and then it does come from an overall leadership within Amazon that really fosters this and encourages it. And it started with this drawing. So this is a very famous drawing that apparently Jeff Bezos scrawled on the back of a napkin one day sitting in a restaurant. It's called the flywheel at Amazon. So if you start with customer experience, that's really where it begins. If you deliver a great customer experience, and you're in the web business, for example, that will drive more traffic to your site. More traffic, as we saw in the case of Amazon, allowed it to become not just a bookseller, but what we now call the everything store, right? We were able to bring third-party sellers on because they saw the value in selling their goods and services on the Amazon site. More sellers equals more selection, and that economy of scale that we get from having a lower cost structure allows us as a company to pass lower prices down to our customers. And it just keeps going. Once you get momentum on that flywheel, it doesn't stop. Well, it starts there, but it really does require that you measure, improve, and iterate. And when I say measure, it means taking massive amounts of data. Amazon is a very data-driven company. Being able to explore, analyze it, and see, is what you're doing actually working? So here's another story within Amazon. So we have this thing called 2 pizza teams. So what does that mean? If you have a lunch meeting for your team, and it takes more than 2 pizzas, American-sized pizzas, to feed that team, your team is probably too big, and you should break it apart. That's the governing rule at Amazon. It's really a microservices culture. And what it allows us to do is build small teams that have huge amounts of ownership and autonomy. And that results in, I love this number, by the way. The first number on the chart, 11.6 seconds. That is the mean time to production deployment on the Amazon.com website during the week. Every 11.6 seconds, a new change is made to the Amazon retail site. We also have these things called leadership principles. And so I've worked at a number of companies that had a mission statement or a vision statement. Maybe people knew it, maybe they didn't. But I can promise you that within Amazon, every employee knows these leadership principles. And I highlighted a few of them that I think are really important to creating a culture of innovation. And you can look these up. You can do a search on the web under Amazon Leadership Principles and see not just the names, but also the definitions. But I highlighted ownership, think big, and learn and be curious, because I think you need to have those. You have to have groups that feel like they have ownership and autonomy. You have to create a culture where you're challenging people to think big and outside of their daily job. And then you have to hire people who are naturally curious. I am sometimes asked if customer obsession conflicts with innovation. All right, so there's a famous quote from Henry Ford. Roughly speaking, he said, "If I had asked my customers, they would have asked for a faster horse." And that's probably true. And so does that conflict? Well, no, it doesn't. Because what you're asking customers for are, what are your problems? What would you want to do better if you could? You're not asking them for solutions. The solution isn't a faster horse, it's the automobile. But it's actually listening to your customer feedback and trying to understand their challenges, and then using that to create your own solutions. So how do we seed and innovate innovation within our own companies? Well, going back to our friends who were building the masted schooners, I think the first lesson is, don't confuse incremental improvements with true innovation. True innovation is bold, and it's not to say you don't iterate. I mean, we do all the time. If you look at the history of Amazon, and I think the Kindle is a really good example of that as well, it's an MVP. It's a minimally viable product. It's something that you know people are going to want and use, and then you rely on the feedback to make incremental improvements. But it's that first release that's the true innovation. Here comes the hard part, right? Creating a culture of innovation requires creating an environment where experimentation is encouraged. And the reality is, when you experiment, you sometimes fail. As a matter of fact, you should probably fail a lot. So you have to reduce the penalties for failure. If the cost of failure is too high, people won't take a risk. That's the reality. And so this is what really inspired us to create Amazon Web Services. People think of the public cloud as being a mechanism for cost savings, and yeah, it is. Cost savings are part of the reason that people move from managing on-premise infrastructure to moving to the cloud. But it's really about enabling innovation. We have this idea of disposable compute and disposable storage and disposable infrastructure resources. You can spin up an environment, test out an idea on AWS, and if it doesn't work, so what? Tear it down, throw it away. You've spent a few hundred or a few $1,000s as opposed to a few $100,000 or a few $1 million if you bought that infrastructure as a capital expense on your own. So that's the key lesson there. You also have to commit to innovation. If you look at the history of the moon launches, right? There were 30 missions, some of them manned, some of them unmanned, missions to the moon prior to Apollo 11. 50%, actually more than 50%, failed. At any point in time, NASA could have scrapped the whole program and said, this isn't working. But you really have to have a commitment to innovation and encourage a structured innovation time. That's another important piece that we have at Amazon. Anyone who has a great idea can move forward with it, right? You start with that press release. The next step is writing a narrative. And that narrative gets reviewed, but if the idea is good enough, and Amazon Prime Delivery is a great example. There was a woman within Amazon who thought, if we had a single fee that where everyone could get their shipments and not have to pay for shipping, I think that would drive up adoption of Amazon. She was right, and she ended up running that business unit after that idea got approved. Emphasize the importance of measuring progress, right? In order to measure progress, you have to have data, you have to do a bunch of A/B tests, and you have to be able to deploy rapidly. And then recognize and reward innovation within your company. And there are many forms of doing this, but I think that's one thing that we do pretty well at Amazon as well. And I'll leave you with this last point, because leadership has to come from the top. This is a quote from Jeff Bezos in a letter to the shareholders. The other thing that Jeff has done is, 1997, when Amazon went public, the original letter to the shareholders, he made a bold statement. He said, if I ever deviate from what I'm saying in this letter, I want you to call me out on it. But this is his quote, and I think it's a good one because it does talk about these points of embracing failure. What I really like about it is where he says that conventional wisdom is usually right, but if you're going to be bold, you have to bet against conventional wisdom. I love that thought, and hopefully that gives you all something to think about. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'll be around later if you have any questions.